Nearly 50 years ago, TV audiences first got to meet the Waltons, a close-knit family living on a mountainside in Virginia. The show was must-see TV in the 1970s.
9 seasons. One mountain in Virginia. A family that millions of viewers welcomed into their living rooms every single week. But behind every warm goodnight on Walton's mountain, there was a real person walking away from the role that made them famous, and the reasons were rarely as simple as the show made them look. A 5-year promise an actor made to himself before he ever said a line. A real stroke that got written into a script because there was no other way to explain it. A death that the cameras didn't cut away from. A budget spreadsheet that quietly pushed a beloved father out of his own family's final chapter. These aren't rumors. These are the documented, on-the-record stories of why the Walton family kept losing its own members, season after season, and why the show never looked quite the same after each one left. Stay with us because the story of John Boy's exit alone will change how you watch this show forever. Richard Thomas is the actor most people think of first when they picture the Waltons, because his portrayal of John Boy Walton, the family's oldest son and an aspiring writer, earned him an Emmy in the show's very first season and turned him into a household name almost overnight. What most fans didn't know at the time was that Thomas had already decided, before he ever filmed a single episode, exactly how long he intended to stay. He later explained in an interview with the Montreal Star that the moment he signed his original contract, he made a personal decision to remain with the series no longer than 5 years, reasoning that staying any longer would risk tying him permanently to one character and closing off the other kinds of work he wanted in his career. In a later conversation with his former castmate Judy Norton, Thomas put it more simply, joking that in the infinite wisdom of a 26-year-old, he decided it was time to move on, because he felt John Boy's arc had essentially run its course once the character had grown up and gone off to college. So when season 5 wrapped in 1977, at the height of the show's popularity, Thomas kept the promise he had made to himself and left. The exit blindsided several of his co-stars. Eric Scott, who played younger brother Ben Walton, has said in recent interviews that he and the rest of the cast assumed Thomas was simply using the threat of leaving as leverage to negotiate a bigger contract, and that he would eventually sign on for several more years the way most actors on a hit show would. When Thomas actually followed through and left, Scott has admitted he felt genuinely jilted, describing Thomas as the glue, holding the ensemble together and questioning why anyone would walk away from something that's successful while it was still running strong. Thomas, for his part, has said the decision was never about conflict with the network or the producers, and that leaving was one of the hardest things he'd ever done emotionally, even if he stood by it as the right professional call. He didn't disappear completely either. He returned for a handful of guest appearances in the seasons that followed and came back for the John Boy character in several television movies decades later, all while building a long and respected career across theater, film, and prestige television that ran for decades after Walton's Mountain faded from weekly television. Losing John Boy left the writers with a genuine problem, because the character was still central to ongoing storylines. Rather than kill him off or quietly write him out, the producers made the unusual choice to recast the role entirely, bringing in actor Robert Whiteman to continue playing John Boy starting in season 8, with the character's absence explained on screen as recovery from a wartime plane crash. It was one of the more talked about casting swaps of the decade, and it didn't sit easily with everyone. Michael Learned, who played matriarch Olivia Walton, has said publicly that acting opposite the new John Boy never quite felt natural to her, and that something about the original chemistry of the show never fully returned once a different actor stepped into that role. Whiteman himself was aware of exactly how difficult a position he'd been placed in. Stepping into a role so tightly identified with one actor, in front of an audience that already loved the version they knew, meant that every choice he made on screen was going to be measured against a performance that had already won an Emmy. He stayed with the part through the remainder of the series and into a reunion film in the early 1980s before shifting his focus almost entirely toward stage acting, eventually building a respected theater career, including praised performances in serious dramatic productions, far from the world of weekly television that had made him briefly famous. Richard Thomas, for what it's worth, has said he had no hard feelings about the recasting at all. He'd already worked alongside Whiteman on an earlier television movie and later admitted that while he felt good about someone else taking over the role, there was still something undeniably strange about watching another actor step into a part that had once been entirely his own. Michael Learn's own departure had nothing to do with a 5-year plan or a recast decision. It came down to something much more personal. She felt her character had simply stopped growing. Learned won 3 Emmy Awards for her performance as Olivia Walton, but by the later seasons of the show, she has said in interviews that she felt increasingly underused, describing scenes where Olivia would be present without much to actually do beyond ironing clothes or asking her children routine questions just to justify her being in the shot at all. She's used the word boring to describe how it felt playing the role by that point, even while making clear that she remained deeply attached to her castmates and crew, whom she has repeatedly called a second family. That combination of creative frustration and a desire to take on more demanding material elsewhere led her to leave the series after its 8th season, with the show's writers sending Olivia's storyline into a tuberculosis diagnosis and a stay at a sanatorium to explain her absence. Her exit landed close behind Richard Thomas's departure and the John Boy recast, meaning the show lost 2 of its central figures within a relatively short stretch, forcing the writers to shift more of the storytelling weight onto the Walton children as the series moved into its final seasons. Even so, Learned has said many times over the years that she never once regretted stepping away when she did, even while admitting how strange and emotional it felt to say goodbye to a character who had defined nearly a decade of her working life and who had made her a household name in millions of homes every single week. Money, rather than personal restlessness, is what pushed Ralph Waite out of the final season. Waite played patriarch John Walton Sr. and had appeared in absolutely every episode of the show for its first 8 seasons, making him one of the most consistent presences on the entire series. That streak broke in season 9, the show's last, when Waite appeared in only a fraction of the season's episodes, a sudden shift that confused longtime viewers who had never known the show to run without him in nearly every scene. Reporting on the decision at the time pointed to budget pressure on a series whose ratings had started slipping after almost a decade on the air, combined with the simple financial reality that a veteran lead actor's salary weighs heavily on a shrinking production budget. Waite was reportedly offered a contract covering only a handful of episodes for that final season rather than the full run he'd had every year before. Despite that abrupt reduction, there was no lasting rift between Waite and the production. He returned for every one of the reunion television movies that followed throughout the 1980s and 1990s and remained close with his former castmates until his death in 2014, which suggests the final season absence really was a budget decision rather than any kind of falling out. With John Walton Sr. largely absent from the last chapter of the series, the Walton children effectively carried the show's final stretch on their own, a fitting bookend in some ways, given how much the family had genuinely grown up in front of the cameras by that point in the run. Some of the departures on this show weren't really departures by choice at all, and Ellen Corby's story is one of the most remarkable examples of a production adapting to real life rather than working around it. Corby played Grandma Esther Walton, a role that earned her 3 Emmy Awards and became one of the most beloved grandmother characters on American television. In 1976, Corby suffered an actual stroke off-screen that left her with lasting physical effects, a medical emergency that the production couldn't simply script its way around. Instead of quietly recasting the role or writing the character out, the show's writers made the unusual decision to fold Corby's real recovery directly into Grandma Esther's storyline, having the character suffer a stroke on screen that mirrored what Corby was actually experiencing in her own life. From that point on, Corby appeared only intermittently, a reduced but still meaningful presence that continued through the show's final seasons. It gave audiences an unusually honest look at a real actor's medical struggle playing out inside a primetime family drama, and castmates have often pointed to Corby's determination to keep working through that recovery as one of the quieter, more remarkable stories connected to the entire series. She continued taking occasional roles beyond the Waltons before passing away in 1999 at the age of 87. Will Gear's exit from the show carried no ambiguity at all, because there was no storyline workaround possible. Gear played Grandpa Zebulon Walton, bringing decades of stage and screen experience to the role, including a career that had survived being blacklisted during the McCarthy era, which made his later life success on the show feel like a genuine personal comeback. He died in 1978, partway through the show's 6th season, after a battle with respiratory illness. Rather than erasing the character or writing around his absence the way many shows would, the production chose to write Grandpa's death directly into the story, giving both the fictional Walton family and the real audience watching at home a shared moment to grieve. The episode built around his death remains one of the most emotionally direct hours the series ever aired, and it arrived during an already difficult stretch behind the scenes, not long before Ellen Corby's health struggles became public and well before Michael Learned and Ralph Waite eventually stepped back themselves. Losing the family's grandfather figure that early in the show's run genuinely shifted its tone, pushing the series toward somewhat more mature storytelling as the younger Walton children grew into adults on screen. Not every departure from Walton's Mountain was dramatic or forced. Cami Cotler, who played the youngest Walton child, Elizabeth, for the show's entire 9-season run, growing up on camera from age 6 to 16, left acting almost entirely by her own choice once filming Wrapped in 1981. She's explained in interviews that she auditioned for a small number of roles after the series ended but found the process far less rewarding than the steady, close-knit environment she'd known on set for nearly a decade. Rather than continuing to chase parts in a competitive industry, she enrolled at the University of California, Berkeley, earning a degree in the social sciences, which eventually led her toward a long career in education rather than entertainment, including years as a classroom teacher and later as a principal helping to launch a charter school. She still attends Walton's fan events and stays close with her former castmates, but acting itself became a closed chapter almost immediately once she left the mountain behind for a lecture hall. Looking back, Kotler has said the decision never felt like a loss to her at all, because the sense of purpose she found in the classroom ended up mattering to her far more than a career built around chasing the next audition. Eric Scott, the same actor who spoke candidly about feeling blindsided by Richard Thomas's exit, stayed with the show for its entire 9-season run playing Ben Walton, developing a reputation among the cast as one of its most steady and grounded members. Once the series ended in 1981, though, Scott made a choice that surprised fans who expected him to keep pursuing acting work the way several of his castmates did. Instead of chasing the next role, he stepped away from the entertainment industry altogether and took a job with a delivery company, eventually working his way up to running the operation himself. It's a strikingly ordinary second act for someone who spent his entire adolescence on a hit television show, and it reflects a pattern shared by more than one of the younger Walton actors, several of whom had grown up almost entirely in front of cameras and felt ready for a more normal life once the show wrapped for good. Scott remains a familiar face at Walton's reunions and conventions and has spoken openly about both chapters of his life without expressing any regret about the direction he chose. It's a career path that, in its own quiet way, says as much about the practical, grounded nature of the actor himself as any of his years on screen ever did. David W. Harper, who played Jim Bob Walton for all 9 seasons, followed a similarly quiet path away from Hollywood. Jim Bob's storylines on the show often revolved around mechanical tinkering and a dream of becoming a pilot, and Harper stayed with the family through the entire run, right up until the 1981 finale. Afterward, he took on a handful of small-screen roles, including a part in the CBS miniseries The Blue and the Gray and a minor role in the 1985 comedy Fletch, before ultimately deciding that a long-term acting career wasn't the path he wanted. He returned to school to study business instead, moving into a private, largely public life-free existence that has continued for decades since. Harper's transition away from acting has remained one of the quieter cast departures connected to the show, mostly because it happened gradually and away from any spotlight rather than through a single dramatic announcement. He still turns up at cast reunions from time to time and has been described by former castmates as one of the most private members of the original ensemble, someone who managed to build an entirely separate identity for himself while still keeping the friendships from his television childhood fully intact. John Walmsley, who played the family's musically gifted middle son, Jason Walton, for the show's full 9-season run, left acting behind for a reason rooted in something he'd loved even before he became an actor. Long before he ever appeared on camera, Walmsley had already taught himself to play piano, guitar, banjo, and several other instruments, real-life talents the show's writers built directly into Jason's storylines. After the series ended, Walmsley continued acting occasionally, appearing in nearly every reunion movie made throughout the 1980s and 1990s, but his professional focus gradually shifted away from scripts and toward the recording studio. He said that pursuing music let him be recognized for his own individual style rather than being permanently defined by a single television character, something that mattered a great deal to him after spending his formative years known almost exclusively as Jason Walton. He went on to work as a touring guitarist and producer alongside a long list of respected musicians and eventually settled in Cornwall, England, building a quieter life centered on performing and recording rather than chasing more screen roles, though he still takes part in occasional reunions with the cast that raised him professionally. In many ways, his path mirrors the choices made by several of his television siblings, a deliberate move away from the very thing that made him famous, in search of a life that felt more genuinely his own. Taken together, these 10 stories show something the show itself rarely had time to explore on screen, that every actor who left Walton's Mountain did so for a completely different reason. A promise made before the cameras ever rolled. A character that had simply stopped giving an actor anything new to do. A budget that no longer had room for a veteran salary. A real stroke folded honestly into a fictional storyline. A death the show refused to hide from its audience. And, for several of the younger cast members, a simple decision that an ordinary adult life mattered more than staying famous. None of it was scandal and none of it was betrayal. It was just real people making real choices about their own lives, choices that happened to unfold in full view of a national audience every week for 9 years. And that, more than any single storyline, might be why Walton's Mountain still feels so real to viewers more than 5 decades after it first aired. If you enjoyed learning the real stories behind these departures, let us know which one surprised you the most, and stick around for more deep dives into the true stories behind the shows you grew up with.